When you're in the flow state, you do think about things less. It does become just more natural and your body just goes almost on autopilot. Once you start getting into them, you progress much faster and whatever you're doing is just better. And I think part of it is because in these flow states, it's more of a subconscious thing and it's just coming out of you naturally. My name is Tony Hegemann. I'm an oil painter and video maker. I used to be a freestyle motocross rider, and in 2015 I decided to backpack around Europe and just fell in love with all of the architecture, history, and art here. So in 2017 I moved to Berlin, Germany, and yeah, just enjoy living here now. I start the painting process in a couple different ways. It just kind of depends on how fast I want to do the painting. Sometimes I'll project the image onto a canvas, outline it, and then start with my underpainting. Other times I try to just do everything freehand. I think it's good to not rely on projecting because then you're not sharpening your skills of proportion. And proportion is one of the pillars of art, in my opinion. Typically, painters will put like a dark brown background and then build on top of that. So that's their underpainting, is like a dark brown or like a gray. Because when you do it that way, a lot of the times you don't have to cover the underpainting completely. You can let it kind of shine through and it won't be noticeable. Whereas when I paint with a bright background or underpainting, it's very noticeable when I don't cover it. Yeah, it's definitely a style. It's a chosen style to do it in that color, yes. Growing up, I used to draw a lot in high school when I should have been paying attention in class, but just did everything with pencil. I never really did anything with paints. It was actually during Corona that I picked up a book called The Decameron from Giovanni Boccaccio, and that compelled me to go to Florence. And so I went to Florence, and it was just being around that much art that I decided to jump back in. I began by just doing sculptures and things like that, and then moved into oil paints, and then I've been doing it since. So I've been painting for about 2.5 years now. Yeah, I haven't been painting too long, but I have a very obsessive personality. So when I focus in on something, I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop doing it, and I will just push and push and push. So what normal people achieve in 5 years, I can achieve in 2.5. And for better or worse, that's a good and a bad personality trait. Once I get the canvas covered, I'll usually come in with like a paper towel, try to get the light areas by wiping away and getting the general proportions of the painting. So I just learned to paint through trial and error and just watching other people do it. There's so much information out there now on YouTube and Instagram. So just watching how other people do it and then trying to mimic that is how I've learned. Yeah, so when I'm painting, I almost always listen to either music or podcasts. I listen to a lot of comedy podcasts because they're light and easy to listen to. I don't have to concentrate very much. Or I listen to classical music or pretty much anything under the sun, rap, pop music, just whatever I'm in the mood for that day. I do feel that there is some sort of a connection between painting and music, and I'm definitely not the first one to point this out. A lot of artists have said this. So I do find that there's some crossover there, and that you can maybe get into your flow state easier with the correct music. And that can change depending on what I'm painting. If it's a war scene, then maybe I'll listen to some black metal or something. I think when you're in the flow state, you do think about things less. It does become just more natural and your body just goes almost on autopilot. And I've felt this in other areas through riding bikes and things like that. It usually takes a couple years before you can get into these flow states, I feel. But once you start getting into them, you progress much faster, and whatever you're doing is just better. And I think part of it is because in these flow states, it's more of a subconscious thing, and it's just coming out of you naturally. Since I've been painting, I've probably only got into that flow state maybe 10 times, where I actually felt like I was fully in a flow state. Yeah, so I still have a lot of practice, I think, before I'm reaching that flow state every time I sit down and pick up a paintbrush. So again, this can change as well. Sometimes I'll spend 15-20 minutes on an underpainting. Other times I'll spend an entire day on an underpainting. Berlin has influenced my art because it has such a rich history and the architecture is beautiful. I paint the Brandenburg Gate, for instance, a lot, and you know, if you look at all the armies that have marched through the Brandenburg Gate over time, the Prussian army, Napoleon's army, the Nazis, then the Soviets, and how Napoleon stole the Quadriga and took it to Paris, and then it was destroyed in the bombings in World War II. There's so much history there that you can use for inspiration to paint. This painting, the underpainting is done on this one. You can see the line still where I set up a grid and drew it out on the canvas to try to get the composition correct, and using whatever rule of thirds or the golden rule, whatever rule you want to use. Architecture and history are big inspirations, but also literature, which I guess is kind of history as well. I find them all inspiring, and that's part of the reason I moved to Berlin and to Europe, was to be closer to those things. Right. I'm attracted to old architecture and old art, the classics, essentially. Berlin's definitely a double-edged sword in that way. Most of it was destroyed in World War II, but they have, you know, they just rebuilt the Berlin Palace, for instance. So they are trying to maintain some of that old architecture here. And this, what I'm painting right now, is actually a statue in Tiergarten. And I find the composition extremely attractive. Just the posture of the body with his arm raised up in this direction and stretched out. It just lays really nice on the canvas. After I get a certain amount of paint down, which I don't have a lot yet, I will get this nifty roller and just start pushing it across the canvas, and it'll pick up the paint. It'll dull the edges, and then maybe put paint down here, put it in weird spots, and it just gives it more of a loose look when you do it that way. Yeah, I still travel a lot, and just like being in Berlin, traveling around Europe, I get to see different architecture and be faced with different histories and different things that you can find inspiration in, for sure. So I do paint into small breath mint boxes, and I use a new box every time because I feel that the box is part of the artwork. You put the paint inside of it. I build a small little canvas that fits inside of it as well with magnets, so you can take it on and off and put it on your fridge or something like that. But the tin is also part of the artwork because you see the palette, you see how the artist uses the colors and how they mix them. Each one of these canvases, this is an actual canvas board. I cut it down to size, and then I prime it. I treat it just like a regular canvas. So it's a tedious process, but in the end it's super cool. You can take it in and out. You can close the box, put it in your pocket. Yeah, I paint plein air. I paint in my studio. I find that painting in different environments poses different challenges. And when you're faced with those challenges, it helps you in the other areas. So if you're better at plein air, I feel like you're better in the studio. So that's why I like to kind of mix it up and get out of my comfort zone. But typically I paint in a studio or my home. Yeah, I prefer painting in the studio just because I don't have any distractions. Every time I go do plein air out on the street, it's incredible how often you'll be interrupted, and people don't care if you have headphones on. They'll come up and wave right in your face to get your attention, and it's just a constant interruption. I wouldn't say that just painters are my role models because I love literature and I find a lot of inspiration in literature. So it's not just painters, but for instance, there's a painter in the US, her name's Jennifer McChristian, and I've taken a lot of my style from her and learned a lot from her. So I do find inspiration in modern artists, classical artists, literature, and yeah. Well, I'd say the most enjoyable aspect of painting is actually putting the paint onto the canvas. I find mixing colors very tedious, especially if you sit there for half an hour or an hour just mixing paints. That can become tedious and a little bit annoying. So I'd say my favorite part is just actually putting the paint onto the canvas. You don't have to think quite as much when you're putting the paint on the canvas as when you're mixing colors. I have to think, okay, what color do I need to mix here to bump the brightness down or change the hue or whatever I need to change. I have to think about it more, and like I said, after like a half an hour, it just becomes so tedious. Well, I guess that's a tricky question, whether or not there's meaning behind paintings, because this day and age, it just seems like people want to throw paint on a canvas and that's good enough. I like to convey a message. I like to show a theme. I like to capture something in history. So yeah, for me, it is very much conveying a message. Yeah. So I've gotten feedback on my paintings and so far it's been pretty positive, but I haven't done a whole lot to try to push my paintings out into the public sphere, let's say. I do have one painting hanging right now in a cafe down the street called Cafe Schätzchen, if I pronounce that. Schätzchen? Oh, it's got the umlaut and then a Z and C-H-E. Oh, man.
It's like German.
Yes. So, Cafe Schätzchen. Oh, I'm sure German speakers will love that. Yeah, I did that painting actually for a speech that was done in the cafe that was about just exploitation of women in the food supply chain lines. So on a painting like this one's getting a little bit closer to being finished, but I'm really trying to stay loose in this painting. You can see heavy brush strokes on this painting, especially up here in the black. You can actually see where I laid the paint on. This is one where I'll use my little roller and you can see that it put a massive thing right here that doesn't really belong there. And I'll just continue to do that around the canvas, and I'll even put down brush strokes quite random like that, and it just gives it a loose feel. Sometimes I just paint something because it appeals to me in some way. I can't even articulate maybe. And then other times it's because I have an idea in my head that I find really powerful and I want to convey that idea. So I kind of do both. I'd say most of the stuff that I convey is from the deep past, nothing really contemporary, no. So I would probably describe my paintings as impressionistic or impressionist realism, I guess would be the term. I don't know, there's probably a better category name out there that I don't know. I try to, in a lot of my paintings, have really expressive brush strokes. So you can really see that I've laid the paint on heavy, and you can see that a painter made that picture. Here you can see in this painting what the roller can do, what kind of effects it can give the painting. You can see all in here where the paint is just kind of random. And then it also can smooth out the edges. You can see all the edges in here between the cools and the more warm colors. They're very softly blended. I didn't do anything besides go over this with a roller. All my frames I buy in the flea markets here in Berlin. I try to buy them slightly damaged and then repair them. Can get them for a little bit cheaper, and I just enjoy repairing the frames. I've almost fallen more in love with frames than I have with painting. Whenever I go to a museum, I'll spend as much time looking at frames as the actual paintings in the frames, because they are works of art themselves. So this one I cleaned up, and then I gold leafed it, and then put kind of random paint all over the frame and smeared it around to give it kind of an aged look. A lot of my paintings are just alla prima. I do them all at once, as thick as possible, and work what's called wet into wet. And by doing that, you can move the paint around the canvas because it's still wet. Once it's dry, it's dry. You can't move it anymore. And I love being able to push the paint around the palette, or excuse me, around the canvas. So I almost always use some sort of a reference, either through a picture that I've taken of an object, or I've been actually incorporating more and more AI. Because I don't want to pay for models to pose for me or anything like that, whereas AI can just program exactly what I want to have, and then I have a sort of a reference picture, and then I put my own twist on it. So I don't ever just paint one for one. Yeah, I think AI can be a really useful tool, but if you don't manipulate it in some way, it comes across as robotic, because it is that. So I think it's great to have as a reference or a starting point, but then you need to build on top of that as well. Some people will consider that cheating, but what's the difference between a picture that's being generated by a computer and me having a model pose in a certain way and taking a picture? I don't know that there's really a big difference. Either way, you have a reference and you manipulated that reference and then put your artistic spin on it. Yes, I would like to exhibit my paintings, but up until this point I haven't, because it's my own mental block where I feel like I have to put in the work first before I can say, here, look at my painting. So I feel like I have to hit that 10,000 hours or whatever it is to become a master at something before I feel like it's worthy of being displayed. So I'm trying to get past that or hit the 10,000 hours. So I haven't really pushed an exhibition or anything yet. So this one's the Rage of Achilles. Like I said, this is from the Iliad from Homer. It's when Patroclus is killed and basically Achilles flips out and enters the war, which I think is like the last 2 chapters of 20-something chapters of the Iliad. So this one is actually not meant for this frame. I haven't painted a painting for this frame yet. I just wanted to fill it with something. But this painting is of a statue in Florence. It's called The Rape of the Sabine Women. It's when Rome was first founded. The Romans were lacking women, so they went to their neighbors and basically stole their women, and this is the depiction of that. This is a painting of a Prussian general. This statue is actually it's next to the Victory Column, and it's of Moltke, an old Prussian general. And his son actually fought in World War I and is one of the main generals in World War I. And this one is a painting of an old Roman idea. And excuse my Latin pronunciation, but it's damnatio memorae or memorae, something like that. And it's when an emperor was extremely hated. When they would die, the Senate would basically get together and say, we're going to erase their memory. We're going to find all the coins, all the art, everything that has a depiction of this emperor, and we're going to erase it so there's no memory of this person anymore. And that's what this painting is representing. I painted this after I went to Athens and saw a statue of one of the wives of an emperor whose face was completely caved in. Someone had taken a hammer and smashed her face in. And so that's why I painted that one. So Instagram, you can find my paintings. That'd probably be the best place, at Hegemann Art. I also have a website, Tony Hegemann, and that should come up. And then for the video editing, I'm doing it it's called Walking into History. And that's where I show my love for architecture, is on that site. Yeah, so I've just, probably the last 3 or 4 months, I've been really focusing on making videos of architecture. I do different kind of walking tours, more ambient, where I put music to it and really focus on the architecture, or more atmospheric, where I walk through a city and you get to hear the sounds of people talking or whatever's going on in that area. I've done a couple informative videos as well, and I plan on moving more into that direction where I'm kind of narrating certain things or telling stories about buildings or what historical events have happened in those places.